Hi, my name is Scott Starker. This is a course called How to Interpret the Bible. This is the 5th video and is entitled Genre, Poetry, and Proverbs. In the previous video, we studied that there are times when we should not interpret the Bible literally in certain places. So I talked about figures of speech and idioms in the Bible. Now I'm going to talk about the genre of poetry and proverbs. Each genre type must be interpreted according to the genre or literacy type or literacy rules associated with the passage. A general observation of poetry and proverbs is how to live wisely and not a literal promise. Poetry. Poetry sets to elicit an emotional response of joy rather than to impart information on the technicalities. The biblical poets and songwriters frequently used poetry to describe their passion to God. We tend to think in terms of rhyme and rhythm in poetry, but in biblical poetry, there are more important features. This feature is called parallelism. And indeed, on occasion, scriptures contain the same event in which the details are described in both prose, in other words, ordinary speech, and in poetry. For example, Judges 4:12 through 24, which is prose. But following in Judges 5:1 through 31, Deborah and Barak sang a song, which is poetry. The use of poetry indicates that the writers were less concerned with precise description or scientific accuracy than with evoking emotion and creating certain impressions. Biblical parallelism. The most important feature of biblical poetry is parallelism, rhyme versus rhythm. There are several types of parallelism, which I will go into them now. Synonymous parallelism. Synonymous parallelism occurs when the second line repeats the first line with little or no added information. Various lines express a thought that is identical to or similar to what has preceded. For example, Jesus says in Matthew 7:7 through 8, "Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened to you. For anyone who asks receives. The one who seeks finds, and the one who knocks, the door will be opened." It would be wrong to make a 3-point sermon here and try to distinguish between ask, seek, and knock. The verses mean that God will answer your prayers. Antithetical parallelism. Antithetical parallelism is the most common. The opposite is said to provide or contrast. For example, Proverbs 15:17. Better a small serving of vegetables with love than a fattened calf with hatred. And Proverbs 10:1, which reads, A wise son brings joy to his father, but a foolish son brings grief to his mother. Step parallelism. Step parallelism is that something is added to the first thought, but the first thought is advanced to an additional step. For example, Jesus says in Matthew 10, verse 40, Anyone who welcomes you welcomes me, and anyone who welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. In other words, God the Father. Chiastic parallelism is where the first statement consists of two parts and the second consists of two parts, but the parts are in reverse order. This can be explained by B, A, B. For example, Jesus says in Matthew 23, verse 12, Whoever exalts himself, A, will be humbled, B, and whoever humbles himself, B, will be exalted, A. And Mark 8, verse 35. For whoever wants to save his life, A, will lose it, B. And whoever loses his life for me and for the gospel, B, will save it, A. Why did the Bible writers use poetry? The amount of poetry found in the Bible and in the teachings of Jesus are impressive because the authors of the Bible were not interested in merely conveying information. They were seeking to elicit a decision and impress the readers with the importance of what they were saying and to get an appropriate result. 2. To make it memorable, the poet's audience were oral learners. Second, to make it memorable because the poet's audience were oral learners, which would make them easy to remember. Finally, not only were they more easily remembered, but they were also more emotive and powerful in their messages. Biblical poetry is intended to convey emotion, etc., not scientific description. The poet of today chooses words, at least in part, based on rhymes, but Hebrew poetry is based on the author's choice of parallelism based on grammar and of the language. And in addition to this parallelism analysis of poetry, one would have to be a specialist on using metrics or rhythm in the Hebrew language to do this. But I'm not going to talk on doing metrics and rhythm, though. I'm going to be talking about parallelism of grammar and language. In the interpretation, though, the exegete dare not assign more than one meaning to individual term, and what the whole psalm would allow. Word studies are not as determinative in the Psalms as they are in the New Testament epistles, and meaning is derived more by the whole than the parts. The psalmist uses many of the rhetorical techniques such as similitude, in other words, the semantic relation that holds between the two words that can, in a given context, express the same meaning. Climax, in other words, a series of statements or ideas that an ascending order of rhetorical force or intensity, and chiasm, in other words, where the first statement consists of two parts and the second statement consists of two parts, but they are reversed in the order. This can be explained by A, B, A. In addition, they use panacea, in other words, play on words, alliteration, in other words, where the lines begin with the same letter of the same alphabet, acrostics, meaning each line begins with a successive letter of the alphabet, and assonance, in other words, similar sounding words. Guidelines for studying the Psalms. Number 1. Structure is the first step in exegesis. Therefore, make note of the strophic patterns, in other words, stanzas, of the poem or hymn. The primary element of Hebrew poetry is the pattern of parallel lines and strophes. The New English translations aid the readers by placing the lines side by side, indenting the parallelisms, and leaving a space between the strophes. The more important criteria for discovering a break in between the strophes is thought development. Furthermore, chiasm or alliteration distinguish strophic divisions. 2. Group parallel lines. The poet is expressing his thought in whole units using very emotive, colorful language. The interpreter must walk a fine line between reading too much into individual lines and assuming symmetry. In other words, the semantic relation that holds between words that can, in a given situation, express the same meaning whenever the thoughts are similar. The reader must avoid the temptation to see too great a difference in meaning in such situations. Yet, at the same time, the context must indicate whether or not the clauses are totally synonymous. Further, it is important to try to determine whether groups of lines are synonymous, antithetical, step, or chiastic parallelism. 3. Study the metaphorical language. In other words, an expression literally denoting one thing is equal to a dissimilar thing to imply a likeness between them. In poetry, the figurative language is more important than at times more difficult to understand than it is in prose. Theology rarely stems from the metaphor itself, but rather from the whole context of which it is a part. Here, structural considerations will tell readers how the metaphor fits in the whole message. Determining whether climatic parallelism, chiasm, inclusio, or repetition controls the psalm is the first step to deciding how the metaphors interact to produce the psalm's message. 4. If possible, note the historical background to the psalm. In many cases, the traditional title of the psalm will provide this, while these titles were added later and are not a part of the canonical scriptures. They are generally reliable traditions, although scholars differ as to how reliable they are. They contain 5 different kinds of data: the author or personal connection to the psalm, historical background, musical notations, liturgical comments, and the type of psalm. Many doubt the authenticity of titles, arguing that they were added at a later stage in the tradition, namely when they were added to the canon, citing the fact that by the time of Christ, even evident in the Septuagint, most of the Psalms have titles. Others give the titles canonical force and argue for their full authenticity on the grounds that there is no evidence these Psalms ever existed without the titles. However, it is probably best to take an optimistic but cautious approach to these titles. On the whole, there is little reason to doubt the basic trustworthiness of the titles, since information has been discovered on similar ancient psalms, and it was likely that a common ancient practice. Yet, at the same time, we cannot assume that the messianic traditions were always accurate, and we must check the historical note by the context. In most cases, the title fits quite well. In some instances, however, there are difficulties. Yet others doubt this, since it is an individual psalm that contains little that would relate directly to temple liturgy and worship. On the whole, it is best to be cautious in such instances. Commentaries will help the reader deal with these issues psalm by psalm. The content of the psalm itself helps even more. To add this historical material, the biblical records makes the message of the psalm come alive. The depth of his spiritual agony and of his repentance are given added meaning in the light of historical occasion. Number 5. Study the psalm in terms of its present and basic stance. Each category of psalm elucidated above, lament, praise, royal, must be studied differently. Some overlap, such as the royal lament, and should be interpreted accordingly. The statements about God and his relationship to his people differ markedly from type to type, and their applicability to present circumstances also changes. Those who wish to worship God will prefer a praise psalm to a lament, while those who are depressed about God's seeming absence from their lives clearly need the latter. Number 6. Study the Messianic Psalms in terms of their historical purpose before noting their eschatological import. Psalm 2, 8, 16, 22, 40, 45, 69, 72, 89, 102, 109, 110, and 132 have in part or even whole been seen as messianic, yet they also have historical dimensions, primarily in terms of David's situations. Both dimensions must be noted and combined to catch the full meaning of the text. The interpreter must first exegete the psalm and determine the author's intended meaning. Many of the Messianic Psalms may not have been intended messianically, but may have been understood as such as in a typological sense. In such cases, we would see the psalm primarily in its original sense and secondarily in its canonical/messianic sense. 7. Study the psalm as a whole before drawing conclusions. The thought flow of the psalm is crucial to its meaning. This also follows general hermeneutical guidelines. After noting the basic structure of a passage and exegeting the details, it is necessary to return and rework the whole before elucidating its meaning. The Psalms intend to be understood as literary units, for they were written individually on single occasions. Therefore, it is more true of poetry than that of prose, that the whole is the key to the parts. Number 8. New Testament poetry must be studied on 2 levels. Since the creeds and hymns are often being quoted, they may have had a liturgical meaning in the life of the church before their incorporation into the particular New Testament passage. Moreover, each had a canonical status, and so that meaning has importance for us as well. The first level is the organizational theological meaning, and the second level is the use of the creed or hymn in the individual context. It must be understood first that an incarnation hymn, its original meaning, and second, as a model for Christian attitudes. Proverbs. What is a proverb? What is a proverb? A proverb is a maxim or a general principle. It is a short, pithy saying, frequently used metaphorical language, which expresses a general truth. Wisdom is a theological pattern of thinking that applies the wisdom of God to practical issues of life in general. It is found throughout the Bible, not just in the book of Proverbs. It is not to be understood as the practical use of knowledge that God gives to his people. A proverb is not to be taken out of context and then misapply them in a literalistic fashion. George Farher said, "A proverb is the prudent, considered, experienced, and competent action subjugate to world and to mastery the various problems of life and life itself." Perhaps the best known proverb is Proverbs 22, verse 6, which says, "Train a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not turn away from it." Is this a promise? Are we to understand it literally? Is it a universal law? But should we ignore Proverbs 22, verse 6, if we want our children to grow up to live a godly life? No. In another example, look at the following proverb in Proverbs 3, verse 9 through 10. It says, "Honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of all of your crops, and then your barn will be filled to overflowing, and your vats will brim over with the new wine." Seemingly contrary, is this a promise to tithe that Proverbs 15 verses with turmoil? Better a small serving of vegetables with love than a fatted cow with hatred. If this were a tithe, would they be so wealthy and successful as it is in the first proverb? Proverbs are not absolute laws. They are exceptions, but in general, Proverbs are true and provide observations of how to live wisely and are directly applicable to modern life. When applying practical wisdom teachings, it is crucial. I will say it again. It is crucial to use the exegetical tools at one's disposal. I'll discuss these features in the videos that follow, in which to ascertain what the text originally meant before applying it to today's situations. Can you think of any modern proverbs or make some up? Today, some proverbs are, "The bigger they are, the harder they fall." "A bird in the hand is worth two in a bush." "Many hands make light work." "Too many cooks spoil the soup." "Absence makes the heart grow fonder." In the next session, we'll be talking about the genre of prophecy, parables, and the gospel writers. Until the next session, session 6.